I still see this. I was told this, don't bring me problems, bring me solutions. And I was like, that's a good little leadership nugget, isn't it?
Mhm.
But then on
Yeah.
reflection, I remember being a little bit uncomfortable thinking, but what if I can't think of a solution? Or what if my solution is actually a bit bad? But we can only see the little part of the system, the little part of the business. We can come up with much better solutions together when we bring a lot of diverse perspectives together. But if we can't have the conversation until we've come up with a solution,
Yeah.
then our solutions aren't going to be optimal. And if we can't think of a solution, then we just don't tell anyone about the problem. Then the problem, like you say, it just gets hidden until it's too big to hide.
Welcome to today's episode of the Product Weekend podcast. I'm your host, Joao Moita, and today we're joined by Tom Geraghty, a leader with vast expertise in digital transformation and psychological safety. Tom is the founder of Psych Safety, a community of people from all industries who care about the topic of psychological safety. Tom's journey is rooted in helping organizations navigate complex change while fostering environments where every team member feels safe and valued. This is a very special episode as it's the first time we're bringing a real psychological safety expert who can also share insights from other teams outside of product. In this episode, we'll explore Tom's insights on building resilient teams, the role of psychological safety in innovation, and actionable steps to empower your team to thrive. As always, you know the drill. Don't forget to follow and leave a review on your favorite platform. Your support helps us bring more insightful conversations to you. Now, let's dive into today's conversation with Tom. Tom, welcome to the Product Weekend podcast. It's so good to have you here.
It's so good to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
So, today we are going to talk all about psychological safety. For the ones that don't know, Tom, he'll tell you more about the experience, but basically has a big community for people diving into psychological safety, which is something that I just recently discovered, that there's this whole whirl or bubble, if you want to call it, of psychological safety. I'm very much trapped in the product management bubble, so it's really good to go out and to find out what other people are talking about. So I'm really excited to dive deeper into it. But before we dive deeper into all these topics, we like to start with a more personal question. And I'd like to know, what's a recent weekend that you really enjoyed?
Oh, what a good question. Actually, this last weekend was absolutely brilliant. We've got a 2-year-old daughter called Fen, and so Saturday the weather was really nice. We like to go hiking and stuff. So we went out in the Peak District,
Cool.
and we hiked up a hill that is one of our old favorite to hike
Mhm.
up. And Fen, she's only 2, but she hiked nearly the entire thing. She had her own little stick, and she kept shouting, "Go!" all the way. And so
So
I was so impressed. She was absolutely incredible. But yeah, she's now hiked higher up, I think, by the age of just over 2 than I had by the time I was about 15.
yeah, I guess maybe already more than I did in my life.
Yeah. Yeah, it was incredible.
Yeah,
Absolutely incredible. I think it was a 490-meter summit.
cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
Really
Amazing.
cool. Nice. Awesome. It must be a very cool experience seeing this baby turn into a little human,
It's
right?
wild.
It must be a,
It is cool. It's wild and scary and amazing in equal measure.
awesome. Cool. So to get it started, let's dive a bit into your background. Like, where you coming from, how you got into this world of technology, but then more into psychological safety. How did it become a priority for you, and also what are you up to more
Mhm.
recently?
Yeah, it's one of those journeys that kind of makes sense in hindsight, but you could never have predicted it.
Like most
Yeah,
journeys, right?
exactly. Yeah. Yeah, so I did a degree in ecology, and then
Hmm.
my first proper job after uni was as an experimentalist. And so we were
Okay.
doing designing and running experiments, and I was for
For what kind of company?
so this was a company, this was a sort of biotech, biotech
Okay.
and lots of associated aspects, and I was at a research station, and I was in weed science, so I was experimentalist in weed science, which is just like the coolest
Okay.
job titles,
Interesting.
and so that was great for a little while, and then I roundabout thing, moved into tech, I started off as a system and then started managing teams, started managing ops teams, software engineering teams, DevOps teams when we were still doing the DevOps teams thing, and ended up as CIO and CTO of various kinds of firms. But and in retrospect, what I find interesting was that I think maybe because of my sort of training in ecology and that sort of more systemic kind of thinking, I was always trying to create conditions in which we could do our best work. So I was always thinking, like, what's the broader system in which people are working in, not just like trying to make people work harder and do the job.
Interesting.
And so that was my approach to leadership. And through that, during that approach, and so I think in about 2014 or so, I came across the term psychological safety when I stumbled across a video by Amy Edmondson. It was like a grainy old TED Talk video. It looked like it'd been surreptitiously recorded by someone in the audience, like they shouldn't have been there. That sort of, and that for me was my light bulb moment. For me was like the moment where it's like, all this stuff I've been trying to do all along that I didn't have a word.
Never
Yeah,
name.
it had a name. It's a real thing. And so I from that point on, that was like a massive door opener for me because it gave me something to hang all this stuff on, a framework for it all, and gave me an angle, like a thing I could say, this is what I'm trying to do. So I started evangelizing about it really and doing meetup talks and blogs and things. And so it gradually turned from an interest, like a passion, then into a bit of a side hustle. I was working after my last CTO gig, I was then working at Red Hat, the technology firm. And people started asking me more and more for sort of training and like real stuff.
How can I build this in my own team?
Yeah. And so we started doing a little bit of that Red Hat, and then I ended up going all in on it full time when we were expecting my daughter. So
Okay.
yeah, and that's what we do now. We're now.
What was it? You were like, okay, I already have so much uncertainty in my life. Let me just add another layer of uncertainty.
Well, yeah, I did read somewhere that if you're going to change something dramatic, you should change it all at the same time. If you're going to quit smoking, you should also move house at the same time because because change is easier to deal with if you're already sort of going through a bunch of other change. So that wasn't the thinking. Oh, a big part of the thinking was I just really wanted to do this, but like I really enjoy this. And I really wanted to do it and focus on it as my main passion. But I was also very aware that running your own business, whilst it's a lot of work, it also allows us to arrange and plan our lives around things like childcare and parenthood and things like that. We have clients who expect us to be in certain places at certain times, but I'm not. I don't have
the flexibility, like being able to adjust some things to. And then if it's your own business, you can also measure the level of like effort that you put. It's on you depending on it, at least in the beginning.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, parents all over the world would be sort of we'll be able to empathize with this, and we'll get a phone call from nursery, saying, "Oh, Fenn's sick, she needs to come home," or we have some other thing, or childcare falls through or something, and all of a sudden your priority changes from your job to looking after your child, and so it's hard to do that if you've got a boss, right? It's harder, at least depending on the boss. Yeah,
cool, awesome, love it. What really resonated here was the parallel between ecology and sustainability with creating an environment for people. That's just the word environment. It makes sense that there's some parallels there. Like I've heard a lot of parallels between architecture and product management, of creating the spaces and things for things to flourish. And ecology, it's an area that definitely, it makes a lot of sense. It's very interesting that you need to like craft things and create an environment where people can actually flourish. Maybe that's where the flourishing comes
this is
from.
exactly it. This is exactly it, and this is why I find that really interesting as well. If you're practicing or studying ecology and looking at habitat, and let's say there were some trees that aren't thriving, or there's a water course that's going green or something, you don't just tell the water course or tell the trees to grow harder, or you look around the system. What's going on? What's changed? What's happening in the system? What factors and variables are sort of moving here? And And what are the other indicators? What else can we look for that might tell us about what's going on? And I think that represents a more progressive way of looking at management and leadership and organizations in general that I think we're seeing more of, like, over the past,
Mhm. Yeah.
recently, and certainly over the past decade.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. And you mentioned Amy Edmondson. Like, also, when we talk about psychological safety, we go more or less with her definition and way of thinking around it. Do you also follow that? Do you have a specific definition? Like, how would you define psychological safety for someone that doesn't know what it's all about?
Very good question, and something we should probably address. Yeah, yeah. So we definitely follow the Amy Edmondson school, if you like, of psychological safety, in that it's a belief that the that you won't be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or
Yeah.
mistakes. It's a belief that the group you're in is safe for interpersonal risk taking. Um, and I
Hmm.
think this is you touch on a really powerful and really important point, because there are a lot of misconceptions and a lot of misunderstandings around psychological safety. And there's sometimes a sticky belief that psychological safety means people will take risks, but like business risks or
Hmm.
safety risks or physical risks. And
Yeah,
that's not the case. That's not when we're talking about interpersonal risks. We're talking about
exactly.
risks we're taking with each other in social settings, in group settings. And that's really important. Psychological safety can lead to the conversations and the environment in which we can take more intelligent actual business risks
Yeah,
and other sorts of risks. But that's the key word here, intelligent risks. Where
yeah.
psychological safety means we can have the conversations about what is safe to fail, what isn't safe to fail, what's important, what are we trying to achieve, and that if something goes wrong, we acknowledge that, coming back to the ecological thing, we acknowledge that if something goes wrong, it's much more powerful to look at it as a system problem. What went wrong
Hmm.
in the system? What other levers and dynamics and variables and things led to this, and
Yeah,
what could we change? Than just trying to blame someone and saying, you did it wrong. You should have tried harder or worked
exactly.
harder or pay more attention or so, because we can always say that with hindsight, can't we? So
That,
yeah, good question.
that's very interesting what you mentioned, the interpersonal risk. So I think it's removing or reducing the interpersonal risk or concern from the other risk discussions, right? When you're thinking of, should I launch this feature or not, like, you're always taking a risk.
Yeah.
But sometimes if the interpersonal risk is high, you won't even consider it, or you won't even say anything, or you won't even bring
Yeah.
attention to the dangers of that thing because you have the interpersonal risk
Yep.
there. So psychological safety is reducing that interpersonal risk barrier
Mm.
to then address the other risks independently. It's not about increasing the level of risk in the other thing.
Exactly that. And if anything, it actually, it definitely does result in lower actual business risk, because it means we can surface those risks
Hmm.
that maybe were too interpersonally risky to talk about previously, or those.
Yeah.
And so we sometimes talk about, in the sort of psychological safety world, and certainly in our world, we talk about the idea of amplifying weak signals. And the weak signals can take two forms. Weak signals can be
Mhm.
quieter voices, those voices that we don't always hear, or even just those sort of little telltale signs when you might be talking about an idea around a table, or knocking around feature ideas, and you can see someone going, sort of sitting back, and their eyes are going, and you're sensing that that they're not quite on board, or something isn't right. That's a weak signal that in a psychologically safe team, you're much more likely to be able to have a conversation about, oh, yeah.
It's easy.
But another
Easy.
weak signal is those little, almost, it might be a bit of data, it might be a spike in some data, it might be some other pattern, it might be some other indicator of a problem, but a small indicator
Hmm.
that by itself doesn't make much sense, or doesn't necessarily raise any alarm bells. But once
Hmm.
we sort of put that together with other things, and we match
Yeah.
other things to it, and then it tells us something important, right? And it's only in environments of psychological safety that we can amplify those weak signals of
Yeah.
either kind, and that leads very much to reducing business risk and
Hmm.
improving business outcomes.
Yeah. Yeah. It's this paying attention to those signals. It's a bit that saying that I think it has some sense. It makes sense in some contexts, but it can also be very dangerous, which is that thing, as a boss, don't bring me problems, bring me solutions,
Yes.
right?
Oh my god.
And
Yeah.
it's like, if you have that approach as a boss, it can be very dangerous, because you will not hear, or you'll not get these
Yeah.
weak signals as
Yeah. Yeah.
inputs. They will be just shut down only when it's a big
Yeah.
signal that you will get that
Yeah,
information.
exactly. This comes up so often, and the thing is, I still see this. I was told this, but I remember being told this by one of my first bosses, 25
Hmm.
years ago or something like that. And don't bring me problems, bring me solutions. And I was like, and it, and I thought, oh, that's yeah. And at the time, you're like, oh, that's a good little leadership nugget, isn't it?
Hmm.
But then on
Yeah.
reflection, I remember being a little bit uncomfortable, thinking, but what if I can't think of a solution, or what if my solution is actually a bit bad?
Hmm.
What we can only see the little part of the system, the little part of the business, the little part of the world that we can see. We can come up with much better solutions together when we bring a lot of diverse perspectives together. But if we can't have the conversation until we've come up with a solution,
Yeah.
then our solutions aren't going to be optimal. They're certainly going to be suboptimal, right? And if we can't think of a solution, then we just don't tell anyone about the problem.
Mm.
Then the problem, like you say, it
Yeah.
just gets hidden until it's too big to hide, until it blows up in our face or it catches fire.
Yeah. That's the one of the potentially biggest consequences of lack of
Yeah,
psychological safety, is like not surfacing these weak signals, as you were phrasing them, and until they blow up in your
yeah,
face. Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
And it has a big cost. That was also something I just did a talk this weekend about, this topic of psychological safety in product teams. And my main point is that this really has an impact in cost for companies and for teams. It's not just a nice to have or a fluffy topic, which I think there's a
Yep.
lot of misconception around that for maybe more traditional leadership, like factory like command and
Yeah,
control type of leadership, that sees this as a fluffy topic.
yeah.
How do you counter that? What are your main arguments
So this is yeah,
for
and this is really it is quite common actually, and I think there sometimes often it's a genuine misinterpretation of what psychological safety is, right? Often it's often associated with well-being, with mental health, and with aspects like that, which is good in a sense because psychological safety is fundamentally intertwined with with mental health and being.
yeah.
If we don't feel psychologically safe, we can't ask for help, we can't tell people when we're struggling or burning out, then yeah, that's going to be bad for our well-being and mental health, and it could be very bad.
Hmm.
But it's not just that's not what it is. To conflate the two would certainly be inaccurate. So sometimes it's almost
Hmm.
an intentional misframing, a bit of a straw man, because psychological safety itself can be very challenging, can feel very challenging, very uncomfortable for, like you
Hmm.
say, those managers and those leaders who've developed a career, who've through the 20th century and through the sort of old paradigms of Tayloristic
Hmm.
command control, that sort of controlling, that hoarding power rather than devolving power kind of
Yeah.
approach. And I think we often we no, we come across or we come up against those sorts of power structures, and we it's important to recognize that it's very difficult for people to dismantle the power structures that got them to where they are, and that
Hmm.
can be very uncomfortable for people. So a lot of what we do
Right.
is to try and reframe psychological safety for them in ways that make sense for them and to pique their interest and ignite a bit of a fire
Right.
that speak to their in fact, to speak to their own fears.
Yeah. Yeah. Because that can also happen, that, so if you're saying that the way that you're doing is wrong, it's a bit like, okay, wait, then my 25 years career, it's a
Yeah.
fraud, and I've been doing it all
Yeah.
wrong, and I'm
Yeah,
useless, and
exactly, and of course
they will see you as
yeah,
adversaries.
exactly, so yeah, so at that point, of course, you're in conflict, and people are gonna
Mhm.
be pushing back, and you may be up against a brick wall at that point, because that's a big thing to address, whereas if we reframe it in ways that make sense and ways that are accessible to
Yeah.
people and that help them realize that actually this just means slightly changing the things we're doing, changing some
Mhm.
behaviors, modifying some practices, maybe changing some structures, but baby steps. And So we will often, before we enter an engagement with a client, we don't do loads around discovery phases and things like that, like the big consultancy firms, but we do work to surface what is driving what are the drivers behind people at leadership level and decision makers. What are their fears?
Mhm.
What are they afraid of? What are they trying to achieve? And in a hospital setting, people are afraid of patient safety incidents. They're afraid of scandals emerging. They're afraid of things like that. They're afraid of budget issues and finance issues
Mhm.
and budget cuts. In a different organization, in a finance organization, you might be afraid of breaches and fraud and things like that. And,
Mm.
and in another organization, say a tech startup, they're afraid of the cost of delay, getting to the market too late, a
Right.
competitor beating them to the mark, or and things like that. So if we can work out the language and the framing that we need to use in order to convince these people
Yeah.
and bring them on,
Mhm.
even convinces, I shouldn't have used that word, but bring people on board. Yeah,
Mhm.
so that's
Yeah.
it's not easy to do always, but yeah.
So just to be sure I understand, and I think if it's what I'm understanding, I deeply agree with it. It's basically that psychological safety. It's something that has many, like, its impact as many facets.
Yes.
Like, it's the mental health that we mentioned, is the speed, it's the risk taking, it's the yeah, you mentioned the examples of the critical industries like
Yeah.
healthcare or aviation and so on. There's all these areas where psychological safety will have a positive impact. So what you do when you're starting to work with someone is understand what's the most critical area that it has an impact, and then start with that
Yeah,
to bring them on, right?
yeah, exactly, and making sure that we not necessarily avoid, but we don't misframe it, because if we use, see,
Hmm.
we could say, so we work a lot with maternity departments in healthcare, understandably, because
Hmm.
maternity has been rather under the spotlight for a few decades, and there's been a lot of stuff that's gone really badly wrong in maternity, and a lot of that has, as Donna Rockenden had said in some of her reports about it, a result of a lack of psychological safety in maternity departments and in the broader healthcare system. So when we're talking to maternity departments, we're talking about the the positive effect that a greater degree of psychological safety would have on patient safety, on outcomes, and that makes sense, and it does. That's a real thing, and it does. If we were to speak to them about, also, psychological safety helps you innovate faster and get to market quicker, things like that, they're just gonna be like, "Well, but that's
Yeah, not
not
interested.
interested. That's not what we're gonna do." And of course it isn't. And of course, on the flip side, if we were talking to the CEO of a tech startup about, "Oh, if we by fostering greater psychological safety, you'll avoid worker accidents and you'll have improved worker safety and lower," uh,
Yeah, that's not
then
something
it's
in a tech
it's
company.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, obviously, they care about the worker safety. They've got some developers working in home offices. It's not as big of a
Hmm.
concern as a massive aluminum manufacturing company or something.
Let's just pause here for a moment. Is the topic of psychological safety something that resonates with you, that makes sense, that you can bring up in your context of work? We'd love to hear from you. So, also, if you reach out and let us know, we'd really love to hear from you. But we would also appreciate it if you can subscribe and leave a rating on your favorite podcast platform. It really helps us grow and bring more insightful discussions. So let us know your thoughts and leave us a review. We'd really love that. Now let's dive back into this insightful conversation. Interesting. Yeah, it's something that we're also trying to navigate as we're diving deeper into this topic. I still think the broader topic of psychological safety makes sense because it's where we're
Yeah,
tackling and it's the thing that we're working on. But then if we think about the outcomes that matter and where we can actually improve, then maybe we can narrow it
yeah.
down. For example, I did a workshop at a big tech company here in Portugal recently, international company but based
Mm,
here, and we did this workshop with the whole product management team. And the outcome that they took a couple months after the workshop, we did a checkup to see if they implemented some things, and they were very positive that it had a very good impact in the way that they were working. But what they mentioned was cross-team collaboration, which was something that we didn't consider or promoted as a desired outcome of the workshop, which was very interesting to find out. That's where we had an impact in that context by developing the psychological safety.
And you know what? This touches on a really interesting aspect of the field of psychological safety, which sometimes is a little bit contentious because the original research into psychological safety, or most of it, has been focused on the team level, right? So groups of people, generally groups of people with a common goal, that being a team. I think we shouldn't get too hooked up on this term team because psychological safety is still a thing in a group of people that don't have a goal. And that's not a team. But there's also a really interesting point here that some of the state of DevOps reports have alluded to, and I'd like to. So we've built on this further, that it's all well and good having great psychologically safe, high performing bubbles in an organization. That's great. That's better than not having them. But but that's not enough. What we actually need is for people within those groups to be able to talk to each other and communicate with each other, and for the friction between groups and functions and layers in the organization to be reduced. And so when we're talking about psychological safety in teams, we also need to be addressing this inter-team psychological safety and recognizing that when two teams come together, or when multiple people from two teams come together, that still constitutes a group or a team, or they're a group of people that are trying to achieve a thing. And sometimes there's almost like an overly strict interpretation of the term psychological safety that leads people to believe that's not an applicable. But it doesn't make sense. Ultimately, we're trying to create better environments for people to thrive and do better stuff, and for everyone, not just whoever.
I think the way we're thinking about it is a bit what you mentioned with this more, let's say, loose definition of team. That, for example, as a product manager, you are part of the product team and you want to build psychological safety within the product team, so with your developers and designers and so on. But you're also part of the product management team, which is with the product managers across the board. And you're also part of your vertical team with the VP and the leaders in the other areas. So that's another team. And you're also part of the product trio team. That's a team in itself, right? So you are part of all these different teams and you can do this work in each of them. But then going back to the definition, the way we define it, it's also very similar. It's essentially this shared belief within the team. So it's not the belief that the individuals have, it's a belief that's shared with the team. So it's like in each of those teams, there's this shared belief that people can take this interpersonal risk.
And so that's a really good point as well. We should note that it is a shared belief, and ultimately, we are human individuals that experience the world only in our own heads. We can't be in someone else's head, right? One of our core principles at Psych Safety is that a team is only as safe as the least safe person. And this is a challenge so there are lots of tools out there, loads and loads of tools out there that you can use to measure, in quotes, psychological safety, and a lot of them reduce.
Do you recommend, just a side note, do you recommend any specific tools that our listeners can check out?
Let's come back to that in a moment. So and it will make sense why I want to come back to that in a moment. So a lot of these tools reduce psychological safety down to a metric, a number, some sort of score.
Yeah, so we can also link in the show notes your article that I read the other day on the what's the name, the principle?
Oh, Goodhart's law and Campbell's law.
Exactly. Yeah. That article, I really like that.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, yeah. So we and this is something we come across a lot, right? So a lot of our clients come to us because they've done a survey, they've done some surveys in their teams, they've done their pulse survey, their annual engagement survey, and everything. And they've got some low scores, and they didn't expect them, and now they're like, oh, what do we do? And one of the challenges with these platforms that even the term score is a problem in itself, because it suggests it alludes to certain things. but the metrics mask the outliers, right? So they often mask the people who have most to lose, who are feeling least psychologically safe in the team. And because you could have a team of 10 people, and if 9 of them say, "Yeah, I'm super psychologically safe," and one of them is feeling like way not, for
Mhm.
whatever reason, maybe they're the only woman or man in the team, maybe they're the only black person, maybe they've got a different accent, maybe, and all sorts of reasons. And but of course, that team looks on a as a metric level, that team
Mhm.
fine. So
Yeah, then maybe it's a matter of the calculation. Maybe instead of an average, you just take the lowest score.
yeah, so you could take the lowest score, but of course that whatever the thing is, whatever you do as scores and whatever you
Then it ends up, okay, who gave this
yeah,
score? Let
yeah,
me try
and
to find the
what
person.
scores and however, in fact, the very existence of scores themselves masks a lot of what's actually going on. Any score, any number always begs the question, why? What's going on there? So what we often do is so we could really get into this. There's a lot of work we do around this area, but what we espouse generally is to a lot of the time maybe skip the whole scoring bit and dive into the why now. Let's do some qualitative research and other practices, lots of other practices we use that help surface what's going on, why, who's feeling least safe, maybe who's feeling most safe, and because that is far more actionable than
Mhm.
some scores in a spreadsheet.
Yeah.
And some of the worst stuff I've seen is where, and I have seen this, where organizations have an actual leaderboard for teams on the wall,
Mm.
which team is
Yeah.
most psychologically safe. And
Yeah. I can imagine how that goes.
what I'm really interested in is what is that actually measuring? Because that's not psychological safety. I don't know what it is. Like maybe it's which manager is slipping the more money to their teams to score higher, or
Yeah.
what is it? I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, so as far as your tools sort of question goes, we actually don't recommend, so we don't endorse any single tool. What we try and do is make sure that people within organizations have the skills, the expertise, the tools, the resources, the confidence to do this work themselves and
Yeah.
not be beholden to a tool or platform or to us, but to be empowered themselves in the
Yeah.
organization to do the work. Ultimately, our goal is to help improve psychological safety. In fact, our goal is to make the world of work a safer, high performing, more inclusive place. And measuring is, in fact, only a very small part of that, um,
Yeah.
which is
Mhm.
sometimes contentious. But
Yeah.
yeah,
No, yeah, that's also a bit how we think about it. So we developed this framework essentially to give the vocabulary to identify the different areas and to give the words to people to dive deeper into different parts of this psychological safety thing. And obviously, we thought about having a score somehow. Business wise, you also know that makes
yeah,
sense, like lead magnet kind of
uh,
thing. But then yeah, there's all these questions and issues like how valuable it is. Ultimately, I think it can work for those teams and those people that are not seeing it as an
mhm,
issue, that when they have a score they can see, oh, there's something that we can
yeah,
work on or should think about,
yeah,
and highlight that as a pain point or something to work on. I think that's probably the main value that you get, but then be careful not to turn it into a target, right?
exactly, exactly. This is, yeah, Charles Goodhart is now going, "Ooh." Yeah, yeah, exactly that. And there's a lot of interesting research into the comparing and contrasting the power of qualitative and quantitative measures in business and organizational dynamics and decision making and stuff. And yeah, just like you say, like numbers, especially high or low numbers, especially on some sort of dashboard with a traffic light thing or something like that, can and do catalyze leaders to do something, to change something, to go, what do we need to do about this next? What's interesting is that, yes, that's a really good way in. That can be a good catalyst. But what actually convinces people, what actually creates that fire in people to do something differently is qualitative, people's experiences, stories,
Yeah.
incidents, what actually happened in an incident, which is why, going back to a lot of this stuff, in order to do this work, we often use a lot of stories. We use a lot of storytelling, things like the Challenger disaster, Chernobyl, the Tenerife disaster of 1977, the Nagasaki train crash, the global financial crisis, the Volkswagen emission scandal. There are endless bad things that have happened in the world that at their core could have been prevented had there been a greater degree of psychological safety somewhere along the line. And that could be a really powerful way to get people on board.
Cool. So I just realized that we're already in the 40 minutes mark, so
Yeah.
we should start wrapping up. There's still a lot to
Yeah.
discuss. I think we would probably it will probably make sense to go for a round two at some point,
Yes. I'd love
to
that.
like deeper and maybe go more in depth into this topic of how it applies to the product world in specific, because you also have experience there in the tech and product
Mm.
development space. Yeah, if you're listening and you'd like to hear more, let us know in any channel in the comments, and we'll try to go deeper in another episode later. But we still have a few minutes. I just wanted to also, as I mentioned in the beginning, this whole psychological safety bubble is a bit foreign to probably most of our listeners. Can you just give a bit of an overview on what's out there for people that are interested in diving deeper? Like your community,
Yeah.
for sure, a great resource. What are some other things? Maybe some books, some people, some key influencers in the space that people can check
Oh,
out.
really good. Yeah, really good question. So yeah, so we have a community. So we help curate a community around psychological safety. And so if people want to head over to psychsafety.com or psychsafety.co.uk, we you and sort of search for community or find those resources. Yeah, we have an online Discord community, which is really great, really thriving, and really interesting. One of the things I love about this work and the community is that there are people from healthcare, from aviation, from and technology and manufacturing and local government and tech and all sorts of different areas and industries that are all interested in this topic. And it's really interesting to see the conflicts, where these ideas merge and the new things that come out of those discussions. So yeah, get stuck in over there. We also have fairly regular online open lean coffee events. So
Yep.
anyone can join. We have anything from 30 people to sometimes 150, 200 people join those, and they're fantastic. There's also the newsletter. Yes, there's 10,000 people on the
Mhm.
newsletter that you can sign up to, and that in itself is quite a community on its own.
Yeah.
And you can contribute things to the newsletter. And so if anyone's got anything they want to write or they've written already and they want to share, then that's one platform to do that.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Awesome.
in terms of books to read and other people to follow, Amy Edmonton's work is fantastic and is the sort of the canonical. Her book, The Fearless Organization, is
Mhm.
the canonical text on that.
Yeah.
For other, if people want to open different doors in this, because I think there are lots of different doors that open once you start getting into this. Just off the top of my head, there's Sydney Decker does some great work in and around human error and a more
Mhm.
systemic approach to addressing the causes of failure in safety critical environments and in organizations generally. And then there's one new great book which I'm just going to find now, and yes, and I'm recommending this just because it's the most recent book that I've read and it's really good. And there's a
Mhm.
great book called Human and Organizational Potential by Ivan Pupilidi and Krista Vessel, which is fantastic, and it's a really
Mhm.
nice introduction to a lot of these ideas that float around the idea of psychological safety. Yeah, that's another one.
Awesome. So just to wrap up, and again, I wanted to dive deeper
Yeah.
into specific tactics and specifically in the space of tech and product, but we'll leave that for another conversation. But you mentioned a lot of different industries that you've worked with and that you have people in your community. See, or how do you think that psychological safety manifests differently in these different industries? Are there some where it's more important than in others? How do you think about that, and what do you see are the main differences?
Yeah, so there are really big differences between industries. I'd hesitate to say that it's more or less important than in some than others, but it
Hmm.
definitely emerges and has emerged in some industries way before others. And in fact, in some, it's still
Hmm.
barely not a thing at all. So if we look at take aviation, I think aviation is probably the best example of where there was recognition back in the 70s. A recognition, they didn't call it psychological safety at the time because it wasn't a well-used term, but a recognition that psychological safety, the environment, it was necessary to create an environment where people can speak up with ideas, questions, concerns, and mistakes to avoid disaster. Because there were lots of disasters, and it was found that a lack of psychological safety effectively was a core factor in those disasters. So, and you can understand why that's the case, because a disaster in aviation is literally life and death. It's very public. It's not only life and death, but it's also very commercial. And one plane crashing with one airline affects all the airlines because everyone goes, "Oh, I'm not getting on a plane." So it was fundamental ethically and commercially. It was essential for airlines to address this. And so they did very early on.
All the incentives were there.
Yeah. But if you look at other industries like retail, for example, it's still very much it's barely recognized, barely acknowledged. And I think tech itself has embraced psychological safety as a concept, but was probably somewhat much, I think, later to the game than safety critical industries necessarily.
Yeah.
Because a failure in tech is not as immediate and visceral as a plane crash.
Yeah.
And then I think other industries where safety criticality is not as prevalent, you see a less of a recognition of psychological safety.
Yeah, probably in tech it was the Google Aristotle project that had the biggest influence in saying that this is a key predictor of team success. So
definitely
that opened up for innovation and high productivity.
And this is it, because the drivers in tech are less about avoiding massive catastrophe and more about how can we innovate faster, improve reliability, and effectively win in the marketplace. So again, back to the drivers, there's a different driver in tech, or generally there is. The tech still exists in safety critical environments, of course, but in general, there's a different driver.
All right, awesome. Tom, it was great chatting today. Yeah, as we anticipated in our pre-recording chat, we would have a lot to talk about, and I think we covered a lot of very interesting topics. Yeah, I would stay for another hour diving deeper, but let's keep that for another opportunity. Really appreciate having you with us. Now people know how to find you. We'll also drop some links in the comments. And also a plug for people in your community if they are working in product management. Also, we also want to learn more about this topic and to hear other perspectives. So feel free to reach out. And thank you so much for taking the time and for the chat today.
Oh no, thank you. It's been a wonderful time, and I'd say for longer as well. So let's do this again.
And that wraps up our episode with Tom. This was a super insightful conversation. You heard it. We'll do it again sometime soon to dive deeper into practical strategies product people can implement in their day-to-day. Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to follow us on your favorite podcast platform and leave a review. It really helps us continue bringing valuable insights to our community. If you think someone in your network might benefit from this discussion, feel free to share it with them. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so connect with us on LinkedIn or send your feedback, in particular your thoughts about the term psychological safety that I mentioned in the middle of the episode, to team@theproductweekend.com. Can't wait for our next chat with more insights coming your way.